Have you ever heard a sound that was both terrifying and beautiful? A voice that seemed to be broadcasting secrets from the edge of an abyss? That was the voice of Ian Curtis, frontman of Joy Division, a brooding prophet on the verge of becoming a legend. And yet, on the eve of the flight that would take him to the pinnacle of his fame in America, he was found not on a stage, but in his own kitchen, after making a tragic and permanent choice. Why does a man turn his back on a dream just as it's about to come true? What darkness could be so profound? His life wasn't a long tragedy, but a supernova, a brilliant flash then gone. And yet, amidst the mystery, his legacy remains. A new genre of music was born, and a voice continues to haunt us, not just for its beauty, but for the terrible secrets it tried to tell. To understand Joy Division, you must first understand Manchester in the late 1970s. This was not the swinging London of pop art and fashion. This was a city haunted by its industrial past. The great textile mills that had once powered an empire now stood as silent, derelict monuments to a bygone era. The sky was a permanent, bruised shade of gray. Unemployment was high, hope was low, and the landscape was a brutalist collage of concrete, brick, and rain-slicked streets. The city itself felt like a ghost of its industrial past, a place of stark, faded beauty. And it was from this oppressive atmosphere of decay that a new sound was about to emerge. The flamboyant rebellion of glam rock felt like a distant memory. But then, in 1976, something happened. The Sex Pistols came to Manchester to play a now legendary gig at the Lesser Free Trade Hall. There were barely 40 people in the audience, but that one night was a spark in the darkness. It was a raw, chaotic explosion of energy that told every kid in that room, you don't have to be a virtuoso, you just have to have something to say. Pick up a guitar and do it yourself. In that small crowd were the future members of bands like the Smiths, The Fall, and Buzzcocks. And in that crowd were three young men, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Terry Mason, who walked out of that show and decided to form a band. All they needed was a singer. That spark had ignited a fire, and the bleak, forgotten city of Manchester was about to become the epicenter of a musical revolution. Ian Curtis was not your typical rock and roll frontman. He was a quiet, bookish young man from the nearby town of Macclesfield. He was a working-class lad who, from a young age, felt like an outsider looking in. He found his escape not in sports or pubs, but in the pages of books. He devoured the works of existentialists like Dostoevsky and Sartre, and the dark dystopian visions of writers like J.G. Ballard and William S. Burroughs. He was also a student of mythology, fascinated by the romantic, tragic legacies of rock stars like Jim Morrison and his own idol David Bowie. He was a young man who seemed prematurely old, filled with a restless intelligence that felt out of place in his ordinary life. He got married at just 19 to his school sweetheart, Deborah Woodruff, and soon became a father. He took a job as a civil servant, working in an employment exchange where he spent his days surrounded by the grim reality of Manchester's economic decline. It was a life of quiet responsibility, a world away from the poetic chaos he read about in books. But the fire was there. When he saw an advertisement that Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook had posted in a record shop looking for a singer, he was the first to respond. They bonded over a shared love for the raw primal energy of punk, but also for the more atmospheric experimental sounds of German bands like Kraftwerk and Can. With the addition of drummer Stephen Morris, the lineup was complete. They called themselves Warsaw, inspired by David Bowie's Warsawa from Low. Their early sound was raw, chaotic, and indebted to punk. But even then, Something different was emerging. Peter Hook, frustrated that he couldn't hear his bass over Sumner's loud guitar, started playing higher up the neck, creating melodic, mournful bass lines that would become a signature of their sound. Sumner's guitar was jagged and minimalist. Morris's drumming was precise, almost robotic. And then there was Ian's voice, that deep, resonant, and strangely detached baritone that seemed to float above the noise. This wasn't just punk rock, this was something else entirely. They soon changed their name to Joy Division, a haunting and controversial reference from a novel about World War II, and began to forge a sound that was as stark and beautiful as the city that had created them. The turning point for Joy Division came when they stepped into the orbit of two men who would shape their destiny. The first was Tony Wilson, an eccentric Cambridge-educated television personality who had become the unlikely champion of Manchester's new music scene. He signed them to his fledgling label, Factory Records, a label that operated less like a business and more like a radical art movement, famously giving its artists creative freedom and no formal contracts. Wilson gave them a platform, but the second man, the brilliant and mercurial producer Martin Hannett, would give them a universe. Hannett was a sonic architect, a reclusive genius who saw the recording studio itself as an instrument. He was obsessed with technology, with space, and with creating atmosphere. When Joy Division entered Strawberry Studios in early 1979 to record Unknown Pleasures, they were a loud, aggressive, punk-influenced live band. They expected to capture that raw power on vinyl. Martin Hannett had a very different idea. A battle for the soul of the band was about to begin. We went into the studio wanting to make a heavy rock album. We wanted to sound like we did live, like a gut punch. And Martin just took it all away. I'd play my bass loud and powerful, and he'd come back and say, "Hookie, bass players are the lowest form of life. They're the slugs of the music world." He made me play high up on the neck, note by note, for hours. I hated it. I absolutely detested what he was doing to us. We were fighting with him constantly. My guitar sound was this wall of noise. Martin would just take it and strip it all down. He'd say, "The guitar's too aggressive. It needs to sound colder, like a shard of ice." He would process it through so many effects that it sounded like a scream from a distant room. He was a madman, but a brilliant one. He heard a dark, hidden soul in our music that we didn't even know existed. The battle was most intense over the drums. Hannett was obsessed with creating a unique rhythmic signature. He forced drummer Stephen Morris to dismantle his kit, recording each drum and cymbal one at a time to ensure there was no sonic bleed between them. He was seeking a cold, precise, almost inhuman sound, a world away from the sweaty chaos of rock and roll. The band thought he was destroying them. In reality, he was defining them. Nowhere is Hannett's genius and his conflict with the band more apparent than in the creation of their masterpiece, She's Lost Control. The song itself was born from tragedy. Ian had written the lyrics after an incident at his day job, where he had tried to help a young woman who suffered from severe epilepsy. He later learned that she had died during a seizure. The song was a stark, empathetic portrait of a body in revolt against itself, a theme that had now become terrifyingly personal for him. In Hannett's hands, the song became more than a story. It became a sonic simulation of that loss of control. He dispensed with a traditional drum kit approach. The sharp, high-pitched percussion you hear is not a hi-hat. Many accounts note a layered hi-hat texture created by recording an aerosol spray and looping it alongside snare hits. The main hypnotic beat was played by Stephen Morris, not on a real drum but on a snare electronic drum synthesizer, an instrument then associated more with disco than with rock. He then layered the track with what he called found sounds. He recorded the rattling clang of the studio's own aging elevator shaft. He captured the sound of a bottle smashing. He was painting with noise, creating a landscape of industrial decay and psychological dread. Ian's vocal was treated with effects to make him sound distant, disembodied, as if he were broadcasting from a cold, empty room. The result was a track that was terrifyingly stark and impossibly futuristic. The sound of the city, the machine, and a human spirit coming apart. But as Joy Division's star began its rapid, searing ascent, a deep and terrifying shadow was falling over Ian Curtis's private life. To understand the abyss that would eventually consume him, we must leave the stage and enter the small terraced house in Macclesfield he shared with his wife Deborah and their infant daughter, Natalie. Their life together began with the simple, hopeful ambitions of any young working-class couple: a home, a family, a future. In her heartbreaking memoir, Touching from a Distance, Deborah paints a picture of a sensitive, often distant, but loving young man. The birth of their daughter, Natalie, in 1979 was a moment of profound joy. For a brief instant, the pieces of a normal life seemed to be falling into place. But the man she loved was already living a double life, not of secrets, but of the mind. He was a doting father one moment, and a remote poet lost in the dark worlds of his books the next. And soon a third, more terrifying element would shatter their fragile peace. His illness did not begin under the glare of stage lights. It began at home. The first major seizure struck without warning. After a drive home from a gig, Ian's body suddenly went rigid, then began to convulse violently on the floor of their home. For Deborah, it was a moment of pure terror, watching the man she loved transform into a thrashing, unrecognizable stranger. The official diagnosis was devastating: epilepsy. The doctors prescribed a heavy cocktail of anticonvulsant drugs. This is a crucial, often tragically overlooked part of his story. His struggle wasn't just psychological, it was profoundly physical and neurological. The medication, a desperate attempt to control the electrical storms in his brain, brought its own private hell. It plunged him into severe mood swings, leaving him lethargic and detached for days, then agitated and volatile. The quiet, bookish boy Deborah had married was disappearing, replaced by a man whose moods were as unpredictable and frightening as the seizures themselves. Deborah found herself increasingly alone, a young mother caring for a newborn while also trying to navigate the terrifying new reality of her husband's illness. In her book, she speaks of the profound loneliness of trying to create a stable home, while Ian was increasingly absent, lost to the demanding schedule of the band and the chemical fog of his medication. The stage, once his sanctuary, was now a minefield, with flashing lights that could trigger a seizure at any moment. His famous spastic dancing was no longer just a performance. It was a terrifying tightrope walk between artistic expression and a medical emergency. The line between the two had blurred into non-existence. His bandmates could only watch in a mixture of awe and terror, never sure if the man on stage was in control or on the verge of collapsing. The pressure was mounting from all sides. And it was in this fractured, unsustainable state that Ian sought an escape. He was trapped between two irreconcilable worlds. In one world, he was Ian Curtis, the husband and father from Macclesfield, a man he felt he was constantly failing. He was wrestling with a debilitating illness, the pressures of fatherhood, and a marriage that was buckling under the strain. In the other world, he was Ian Curtis, the enigmatic frontman of Joy Division. He was an object of fascination, a poet of the new age, surrounded by the energy and temptations of the road. It was here that he began a close relationship with Belgian journalist and promoter Annick Honoré, a relationship whose nature remains contested. Deborah Curtis describes it as an affair. Honoré later characterized it as largely platonic. But this was no simple rock and roll cliché. Their connection was reportedly deeply intellectual and artistic. Hannett understood the literary and cinematic worlds that fueled his lyrics. With her, he could discuss Dostoevsky, Werner Herzog, and the existential despair that was the raw material of his art. She saw the poet, not just the patient, the artist, not just the husband. With Hannett, his darkest thoughts were not a burden to be hidden, but a language to be shared. This relationship, while a source of intellectual solace, added an unbearable layer of guilt to his already fragile mental state. He was a deeply moral person, and the weight of his betrayal of his wife and family was crushing him. He was now two people, living two lives, and the chasm between them was tearing him apart. This is the raw internal conflict that is laid bare in the band's music, especially in the lyrics he was writing for their second album, Closer. He wrote with a brutal, almost unbearable honesty about his failing marriage, his guilt, his illness, and his sense of isolation. Songs like Isolation and Passover were not just artistic expressions. They were raw, desperate diary entries. And then there was the song that would become their most famous, Love Will Tear Us Apart. It was a devastatingly beautiful and poignant summary of his predicament. A man torn between the love that represented duty and family and the love that represented escape and understanding, trapped in a situation with no exit. He was writing his own tragedy in real time, and the world was listening. But no one seemed to realize it was a cry for help. By the spring of 1980, Ian Curtis was on the brink. The band had finished recording Closer, an album even darker and more claustrophobic than their debut. With their first North American tour imminent, the band were preparing to depart for the U.S., a tour that was meant to be their triumphant breakthrough. But for Ian, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a death sentence. His health was in a catastrophic state. His seizures were becoming more frequent and more violent. His marriage was over. Divorce proceedings were already underway. The guilt from his affair was eating him alive. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, and he felt completely, utterly trapped. He reportedly confessed to Tony Wilson that he had no desire to go to America, but he felt he couldn't let the rest of the band down. The pressure to fulfill the dreams of his friends, his label, and his fans had become an impossible burden. On the night of May 17, 1980, Ian was at home alone in his small house in Macclesfield. He had asked his wife, Deborah, to stay elsewhere for the night. He spent his final hours watching one of his favorite films, Werner Herzog's bleak and tragic Stroszek, a story about a man who travels to America in search of a better life, only to find despair and ultimately suicide. Afterwards, he put on Iggy Pop's album, The Idiot. Sometime in the early hours of May 18th, Ian Curtis wrote a final heartbreaking letter to his wife. Then in the small kitchen of the house where he had started his family, he took his own life. He was just 23 years old. The American tour was set to begin later that week. The death of Ian Curtis left a profound and painful legacy, one that is still debated today. The central controversy, if you can call it that, revolves around the mythologizing of his tragedy. In the wake of his suicide, he was instantly elevated from a musician to a martyr, a tortured poet who was too sensitive for this world. His dark, introspective lyrics were no longer just songs. They were treated as prophetic suicide notes. This romanticization of his pain is a complex and troubling issue. On one hand, it's a testament to the power of his art. He wrote so convincingly about despair that people felt they understood his fate. But on the other hand, did this mythologizing obscure the real man? Did it overshadow the fact that he was not just a Gothic icon, but a young man suffering from a severe, debilitating neurological disease and profound clinical depression? This leads to the tragic question of whether his art was a cry for help, tragically misinterpreted as performance. Bernard Sumner has spoken about the immense guilt the surviving members felt, wondering if they could have done more. He said, "We didn't see it coming. He was a great actor. He acted like everything was fine." They were all just working-class kids in their early 20s, completely unequipped to handle the complexities of mental illness and epilepsy. The tragedy of Ian Curtis is not just that he died, but that he was suffering in plain sight, and the very art he used to express his pain may have inadvertently masked its true severity from those around him. The significance of Joy Division cannot be overstated. In a career that lasted less than 4 years and produced only 2 studio albums, they created a sound that would influence generations of musicians. They were the bridge between the raw fury of punk and the atmospheric, introspective sounds of post-punk, new wave, and goth. Without Joy Division, the musical landscape of the 1980s and beyond would be unrecognizable. Bands like The Cure, U2, Depeche Mode, and REM all drew heavily from their sonic template of melodic bass, atmospheric guitar, and emotional intensity. Their influence extends to modern indie and alternative rock, with artists like Radiohead, Interpol, and The Killers all citing them as a major inspiration. They proved that music could be dark, melancholic, and intellectual without sacrificing power and beauty. But perhaps the most powerful part of their legacy is what happened next. After Ian's death, the surviving members, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Stephen Morris, were faced with an impossible choice. They could have disbanded, forever defined by the tragedy. Instead, they chose to continue. They regrouped, with Sumner reluctantly taking over vocal duties, and formed a new band. They called it New Order. From the ashes of Joy Division's darkness, they created a new sound built on synthesizers, dance beats, and a sense of cautious optimism. It was a remarkable act of resilience, a testament to the healing power of creation. Ian Curtis was a conduit for a beautiful and terrifying kind of darkness. He was a poet of alienation and despair whose work gave a voice to the silent anxieties of a generation. But behind the myth, behind the iconic album covers and the haunting voice, he was a young man from Macclesfield. He was a husband, a father, a son, and a friend. He was a man who was profoundly ill, fighting a battle with his own body and mind that he ultimately could not win. His story is a tragic and powerful reminder of the fragile human being behind the art. It's a cautionary tale about the immense pressures of fame and the devastating consequences of suffering in silence. Ian Curtis left the world far too soon, but he left behind a body of work that is as timeless and resonant as the bleak landscapes that inspired it. He was a poet of alienation, a voice from the unknown pleasures. And though the man is gone, his haunting echo will never fade. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And please subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for watching.